This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM, all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.
Philosophy Bakes Bread is a production of the Society of Philosophers in America, a.k.a. Sophia. I'm Dr. Eric Thomas Weber.
And I'm Dr. Anthony Cashio. A famous phrase says that philosophy bakes no bread. That is simply not practical. But we, in Sophia, and on this show, aim to correct that misperception.
Philosophy Bakes Bread airs on WRFL Lexington 88.1 FM and is distributed as a podcast next. Listeners can find us online at philosophybakesbread.com, and we hope you'll reach out to us on Twitter at philosophybb, on Facebook at Philosophy Bakes Bread, or by email at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com.
Last but not least, you can leave us a short recorded message with a question or a comment or even some bountiful praise. Eric loves his bountiful praise.
Yeah, I do.
I always like to imagine him sort of bouncing around in it.
All right.
We may be able to play it on the show. You can reach us at 859-257-1849. That's 859-257-1849. Today, we're ecstatic to be talking with Patricia Shields. Welcome, Patricia.
Well, welcome to you, too.
Yeah, excellent.
Excellent. Patricia Shields is the editor of Jane Addams, progressive pioneer of peace, philosophy, sociology, social work, and public administration, which is published in 2017. We'll be talking with Pat today about Feminism and Peace and Jane Addams' legacy. We're very excited about this conversation.
That's right. Dr. Patricia Shields is professor of political science at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. She's also editor-in-chief of the journal Armed Forces and Society, the leading peer-reviewed journal on civil-military relations. I came to know Pat from a distance back when I was in graduate school in Illinois, and I had come upon her work on Charles Peirce and John Dewey in connection with public administration. I reached out at the time, and she knew my dissertation director, Larry Hickman, who's been a guest on our show back in episode 40 of the show on democracy and education today.
You know Larry, Pat?
Yes, I have met him. I was ecstatic when I got a chance to meet him. He certainly influenced me.
Oh, he's a great guy.
He's a really great guy. Really fantastic. So Pat's work has been recognized many times and in many ways. She's received teaching awards from the National Association for Schools of Public Affairs and Administration, the Leslie A. Whittington Excellence in Teaching Award, the Texas State Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Everette Swinney Teaching Award, as well as Professor of the Year from the Central Texas Chapter of the American Society for Public Administration. Wow.
That's quite a list. And Pat has published over 60 articles and book chapters, as well as 4 books, and won the 2007 Public Administration Review's Laverne Birchfield Award for the Best Review Essay, as well as Texas State's Presidential Seminar Research Award back in 1984. You're a prolific scholar, Pat, and we'll get to your latest book very soon. But before that, as you know, we want to make sure that our listeners know you as a person. So we call this first segment, Know Thyself. And we want to know whether you know thyself, but more importantly, we want to learn about you, the person behind the philosopher. Tell us about yourself, where you grew up, how you came to be who you are, and so on. Who is Pat Shields?
Well, Pat Shields was born in Portland, Oregon, and her father was he worked for the Department of Agriculture inspecting grain elevators. And one of my first ever memories was hugging his legs and finding grain in the cuffs of his pants.
Nice
so I had a very tangible, and he was a public administrator, which was one of the reasons I got interested in public administration. And then when I was 13, he was transferred to Washington, D.C. And so I moved to Washington, D.C. and went to the University of Maryland for my undergraduate degree in economics. And I went to Ohio State for a master's in economics and a PhD in public administration. I think that early experience with my father with public service informed my interest in public administration.
Not everyone follows in their parents' footsteps, right? I guess my father's a banker. I didn't really kind of maybe let him down going into philosophy. So, what was it about watching your own father and the work he did that kind of appealed to you?
Well, I think it opened actually, there was a really weird thing that happened. Our family was going to go to the Dominican Republic, and he was going to teach people how to run grain elevators. And I did some babysitting and came and learned that the grain elevator had collapsed from the people. And then I told my father, and then we didn't go. And it was like, how did that happen? How did this big federal government, and yet this babysitter makes a difference in terms of us learning that we weren't going to be traveling to the Dominican Republic. So that was just intriguing. What was going on behind the scenes? I just wanted to understand it more. So, and I would say with my economics background, and I switched from economics to public administration, partly because I did like that economics had a strong theoretical framework, but it was all founded on assumptions of selfishness and of self-interest as being the guiding factor in economic behavior. And moving to public administration gave me a new, enabled me to not have that selfishness. To me, it would be bad for my soul to have a career in selfishness. But public administration didn't really have the kind of ideas that I was interested in.
So this is intriguing, Pat, about human nature. You were studying economics, and there were all these assumptions, in economics of, self-interest being the fundamental motivator. Why did that come across as wrong to you? What is it that you think motivates people?
Well, I think that your motivation is pretty darn complex, and of course, people are interested in self-interest, but there's something that's much larger. Well, why would anyone sacrifice their life for another? That's certainly not self-interest. Anyway, that there is something larger than just the self. And I would say one of the things that really influenced me early on was the Vietnam War. And I can just remember that you were just constantly hearing the casualties, how many people died when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. And then when I was in college, the Vietnam War was at its peak. And I was at the University of Maryland, and this was a place where there was lots of protesters. And I would go to the protests sometimes, or at least the bonfires at midnight. And I thought it was very interesting. I didn't think the war made sense, but I didn't necessarily think the military was wrong, that it was kind of following orders. What was the alternative? They would go against the presidential orders. That didn't make sense to me. So, and the university shut down. They were National Guard with rifles. The end of my freshman year, wandering the campus of the University of Maryland. And I went to all-girls Catholic high school, and I was confused, I guess. I wanted to contribute to this experience that we had at the Vietnam War, but I didn't exactly know how. And when I was in graduate school, I learned about, I was able to do a dissertation on the equity of the draft during the Vietnam era and I worked for a research center that had the data available to really answer that question. And I found that Black high school graduates really bore the burden of the draft. And during the Vietnam War, for one reason, they were unable, they didn't go to college, so they didn't get the deferments, but also the military could take who they wanted, and they wanted people who could read and write and had good educations. And African Americans from the South had terrible educations often because of the school system, and they often didn't complete high school. So it was the high school graduate that was more likely to be drafted, more vulnerable to the draft system. And that's what kind of got me into studying the military, because actually I published my first article in Armed Forces and Society, the journal that I edit. But I also, and I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how did this person with economics and public administration get into philosophy?
That was my next question.
Well,
how did that happen?
Yeah, a good question. I actually was public administration, and I guess I'll give you a definition of it because I think, which is informed by Dewey, and I see it as the stewardship and implementation of the products of a living democracy.
Ooh.
There's a lot to unpack in that definition.
Right. So it deals with values as stewardship, and one of those values could be efficient use of our resources, which is our people and our finances, but it's also the implementation. So how does the mail arrives at your door, the Social Security check with the right amount arrives at your, in your bank, I guess. But all these things that we call the public sector, they have somehow they get done. William James, making things work. Public administrators make our policy framework work, but they do it within the context of a living democracy, and that means an imperfect democracy, and with the democratic values, which is, and I'd see them as the stewards in some ways of those democratic values. So I was in public administration and finance, and I'd written an article called Freud, Efficiency, and Pragmatism, which looked at user fees through the theoretical lenses of the economist, who saw a user fee as a price, and social work, which actually drew from Sigmund Freud. Freud said if you get better faster, you'll get better faster if you pay an appropriate amount. So, and then the third one, the pragmatism, was the lenses of public administration. And I got a letter from Amitai Etzioni, who at that time was the chair of an ethics chair at Harvard, in the Harvard Business School. And he said he was reading that article, he loved it, and he was sharing it with his colleagues and with his students. And I was pretty excited to get a letter like that, so I was Xeroxing it. And the chairman of the philosophy department walked by, Vince Louisi, and he could tell I was excited. And he said, well, what's happening? And so I showed him the letter, and he said to me, I would like to read that article. And I said, why does a philosophy department want to read something about user fees? That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so I said, well, why do you want to look at this article? And he said the words that changed my life. He said, I study pragmatism. I said, what? Pragmatism is a philosophy. It's a way of thinking. And I didn't know it. And I had reflected on that article, and I said, well, the economists have a strong set of ideas, and the social workers have a pretty clear organizing principle, but I didn't really feel like public administration had it exactly. And so I said to Vince, I want to know more about this thing called pragmatism, because I would like public administration to have a clear organizing principle from my perspective. So his office was on the way to the bathroom, and I stopped in, and I said, "Can you tell me more about pragmatism?" And he
don't take too long, because I have to pee.
Right, or well, on the way back, maybe. Anyway, he started giving me books and articles to read. The first one was Vince seemed to me to be perfect because he was a chair of a philosophy department. So he was a public administrator. He didn't know it, maybe. He also was a lawyer. So he understood the law, and public administration is about implementing laws. Where do we get the authority to do implementation? It's through laws. And he studied under Betty Flower as a pragmatist. So, and he was just so willing to mentor me through the early period of whether or not pragmatism did offer public administration some kind of organizing principle that, besides making it work, which I think that's pretty important, but that there was democratic theory and Dewey's wonderful notions of democracy. And then I started looking at, aside from Peirce, and Peirce actually did work for the National Geodetic Service.
That's right.
And the Survey of the Coast. So he was a public administrator. And from my perspective, what he was interested in is making sure the ships didn't hit shoals. Sort of pragmatism kind of came from the pragmatic perspective of, how do you know whether you're a success in your survey of the coast? It's because the ships arrive and they don't wreck. So
it's a pretty good measure, right?
So that, I mean, in a way, I sort of saw that as what Peirce was doing, and there was roots in public administration. And then Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., my gosh, he's one of the most important legal theorists, not to mention he's a Supreme Court justice.
That's right.
And Jane Addams suddenly got in there. I mean, a woman? I thought, and Dewey with his interest in children, and Dewey just seemed like an amazing person. He was interested in democracy and democratic classrooms and suffrage, and was such a public philosopher. All of those ideas, and so there was a sort of a flexible organizing principle, and it seemed to tie into what public administration could be. And actually, after I had done quite a bit of studying, I finally came up with that definition that I just gave you, because it was understanding Dewey, and actually Hickman, and what products are, sort of flipping the on its edge the notions of Plato in terms of the hierarchy. Maybe the people who are concerned with the products have some import, not just the people with the ideas. So with his book on technology, anyway, Hickman's book on technology.
Well, Pat, we're over time for this first segment. Well, we have to ask you an important question that we always ask in the first segment, and we'll come back to pragmatism, and especially with regard to Jane Addams in a moment. But we got to ask you this question that Anthony always likes to ask. Oh
yeah, I love asking this question, and actually, you're a perfect person to ask, because you didn't come to philosophy the same way most academic philosophers come to it. And the question is simply this: what is philosophy?
Well, from my perspective, it's about ideas, the study of ideas, and it's how ideas shape our lives, and then how our lives shape ideas.
That's awesome. How ideas shape our lives and how our lives shape ideas. That's fantastic. Well, everybody, we're going to come back. We have lots more questions. We want to hear lots more from Pat Shields, but fortunately, we have 3 more segments to do that. This is Eric Weber. My co-host is Anthony Cashio, and you've been listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. We'll be right back.
Welcome back, friends, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber here talking today with Pat Shields about Feminism and Peace, Jane Addams' legacy. We figured that we begin the second segment talking about Jane Addams' feminism and what relation that had, if any, to her publicly engaged work. Then in the next segment, we'll ask you, Pat, about whether and how that may have led to her advocacy for peace, for which she was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Sound like a good plan, Pat?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Excellent. Well, Pat, we've actually had a few episodes focusing on Jane Addams. She's sort of quickly become one of our favorite historical thinkers on Philosophy Bakes Bread. But each person introduces her as a figure differently, and some listeners may not have heard this episode. So let's start with the big question. Who was Jane Addams? Why do we need more people to learn about her today?
Well, Jane Addams was one of the leading public philosophers of her time. She was born in 1860 and she died in 1935. As she's known for her work in the settlement movement and leading the settlement house known as Hull House in a Chicago neighborhood. And personally, I got interested in her because she was listed as one of the founders of pragmatism in an encyclopedia of philosophy that I had read. And I wanted to see how her ideas might influence pragmatism and how it's applied to public administration. So one of the most important books for me was Charlene Siegfried's Pragmatism and Feminism, Reweaving the Social Fabric, because that explained how pragmatism was connected to feminism, but also Jane Addams was among the women, the leading feminist pragmatist. So that made me want to explore her feminism and move in to really get to know Jane Addams. And I would say I got some insights when I finished the book on Jane Addams and looking at her as a pioneer and how she was a feminist, or what I really would say brought feminine standpoint to philosophy. And I saw this as really her reaction to paternalism. And you could almost see her notion of feminism as concentric circles, which are barriers for her, and yet they also are ways of she stays within and moves without. Her father was the banker, and he was the owner of the mill in a small town in Illinois, Rockford. And he had a strong social ethic, and he also really believed women belonged in the household. That was the idea at the time. And so her mother died when she was 3, and it's a very really a tragic story. Her mother was 49 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. Oh, no. Her husband was in the Capitol and this was during the heart of the Civil War. He was a state senator, and as the good sort of lady of the manor or the prominent woman who was a caring woman, she went during a snowstorm. She helped deliver the baby of a mill worker, and on the way she slipped, and this led to her death and the baby's death. Oh, so man. Jane was 3 years old and this happened to her, and this set up a very close dynamic with her father. And then when she was 8, 9 years old, he remarried, and she had a contentious relationship with her stepmother. So she was in this sort of world of wanting to be close to a beloved father and also wanting to escape. And I think this kind of set up a dynamics for her of seeing the importance of the wall, but also the need to transcend it. And then when she went to college, and this was new, it was Rockford College was just opened up, or seminary was just opened up for women. She realized that something was going to be changing with women. Even in her junior oration, and well, I guess I'll step back a minute. I think she discovered there that she really could thrive in an environment where there was a lot of women learning, because she was the valedictorian. She was a president of the class. She was a president of the debate club. And she was also the editor of the newspaper. So she was developed. Right. I think the class, though, might have been 15 people. So it's not. But still, what the point I'm trying to make is that here she was developing skills for writing, because she ended up eventually writing 11 books. She was a famous speaker, and she learned how to, in the debate club, she worked with speaking. And she was a good thinker to be the valedictorian. All of these things, in a way, she transferred this kind of environment where she really thrived into a Hull House. And if you can think of it, a transferring of that environment, I think that began to make more sense. But when she was 20 years old, in her junior oration, she talked about, it was called Bread Givers, was the name of the speech, and she talked about how women's role was going to change over their lifetime, that women would claim the same right to independent thought and action as a man. So she knew this at 20, and she wanted to make it happen and do it in a world where she could thrive, which ended up being Hull House, I think. So if you go back to the concentric circles, one of the first books that she wrote was Democracy and Social Ethics. And this book, she talked about the world beyond the family. And that, in fact, when she was Hull House, and the experience of Hull House was a way for women who were trapped in the ethic of the family, of the private ethic, to expand their world and their service to the world. And this was kind of the heart of her feminism.
I want to follow up on something you said, because some of our listeners will know about Hull House, but some of them, if they haven't heard our past episodes on Jane Addams, won't know what Hull House is. So what would you say is Hull House for those who haven't heard of that?
Well, Hull House was a settlement house. I think it was the biggest or the most well-known settlement house. And she came of age during the period when there was industrialization, and cities around the United States, and particularly Chicago, where she lived, vast immigrant communities had moved in and moved to Chicago. There was a lot of poverty. There was an industrialization without really concern for the individuals who were working there. And what, in recognition of these urban problems, the settlement movement developed homes or group homes, which the people came to the community. They tried to interact, or the idea was social progress, but from her perspective, it wasn't, we're going to tell you what you need. It's, we're going to learn from you and try to figure out this together. And so it was a community. And the Hull House had a campus where people lived at Hull House, and they offered services like there were all kinds of classes. There was actually dormitories for young women who worked in factories, so they'd have a place to live, because women, it was maybe too far for them to go to their homes, which may have been in the rural areas, or who knows what reason, but there's plenty of reasons where there might have been single women needed a place to live and then to work. But there were classes, there were drama classes, there were coffee houses, there was daycares, and there was even a museum, a labor museum. And this was a sort of a hub in the neighborhood. And from there, they wanted to, in some sense, transform the neighborhood so that it would be a better place to live. And for me, one of the images that it makes it clear that's very problematic was the horse carcasses that were everywhere because garbage wasn't collected as well as it should have been. What do you do when a horse dies? And children would play on the horse carcasses. So if you have a world where kids are playing on horse carcasses, you could imagine that they may have some health problems.
That is pretty gross.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine there was some. Just go outside and play with the horse, baby.
There are some. I've seen some pictures of kids on horse carcasses because I wanted to see what. But I think that's a good image of there's a lot of problems in this neighborhood, and so she worked with the people with the community and the Hull House residents. And one of the first things they did was work on playgrounds, but also what can we do? And this was a period where there was a lot of corruption and how can we fix or recognize this corruption or stop it so that we can actually have cleaner streets? And was involved in organizing the community to make that happen. And she was also, there's a lot of scientific inquiry because the infant mortality rate was something that she watched. And after this organization and this change in their collecting the garbage that they were supposed to, the infant mortality rate was cut in half for that neighborhood. So her notion of working in the community, she was described Hull House or the settlement movement as an experimental effort at addressing the problems of the great industrial cities. And so sometimes something would work or maybe it wouldn't work, but in an experimental effort.
Fantastic.
That's good. Well, Pat, you've kind of presented two really interesting aspects of Jane Addams' thought and work here, right? With her work with her, I like how you put it, with her feminine perspective on pragmatism, as well as sort of the advocacy work she's doing with Hull House. Did Addams see those two connected in an important way? Like, did her feminism drive her work at Hull House or vice versa? Or was there sort of an organic relationship there?
I think it would be organic because she was constantly learning. She also was pretty close to John Dewey. I think her notions of inquiry and his notions of inquiry were influenced by the kinds of things that they would do at Hull House, like develop the maps of the neighborhood, do all kinds of research on figuring out what the neighborhood was. But, I think what her idea was to bring the feminine standpoint into understanding how to make progress or change in society. And
excellent.
So
like that.
There were a lot of clubs, women's clubs, and these clubs were helping to change or address the problems that were happening throughout the country. So women couldn't vote, but they could influence their communities through these clubs. And she took one of the ideas of this club called municipal housekeeping and helped to look at it as an idea. In fact, like Sally Hasslinger, she found a broadside written by Jane Addams, which was talking about municipal housekeeping, which is thinking in changing the model of government or of cities from what they saw as a citadel that would be protected by, that had to be concerned about invaders, to a household. It should be run like a family. We need to care about the people inside our city. We need to keep things clean, make our streets clean, bringing feminine sensibility to looking at city management. And this is where her theories connect with public administration, but it's a notion of caring about the people inside your city, which is bigger than your household, right? So these concentric circles are moving from the home to the city and ultimately move out to the world with her work on peace.
That is fantastic. And that's exactly where we're going with the next segment. We have to take a short break right here, but thank you all for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is is Eric Weber. My co-host is Anthony Cashio, and we've been talking with the wonderful Pat Shields. We're going to come back with the next segment to ask about precisely that connection between feminism and peace. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll be right back.
If you're hearing this, that means podcast advertising works. WRFL is now accepting new applications for advertising in a selection of our original podcast series. If you or someone you know owns a business in Central Kentucky and would be interested in advertising on WRFL's original podcasts, please email development@wrfl.fm.
Welcome back to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber talking today with Pat Shields about feminism and peace, Jane Addams' legacy. We're having an absolutely wonderful conversation. I'm learning just tremendous amounts about Jane Addams, someone who I already thought I knew a lot about. In the second segment, we asked Pat about Jane Addams' feminism, and we learned a lot about Whole House and the relationship between those two. In this segment, we're going to ask about Addams' advocacy for peace, right? We ended the last segment, and Pat was giving us this beautiful image of sort of concentric circles of caring. We care about the family, we care about our communities, care about the city, and ultimately we end up expanding this to thinking about the world, right? So we've had several episodes talking about Addams, but have said very little so far about her work, for which she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. So why don't we get right to it?
Great. Well, how did I get in looking at Addams and peace? Well,
yes.
I felt for a long time in my career that I had like two hats and they never intersected. One was the military and the other was pragmatism and public administration. And then I began looking at peacekeeping and looked at the sort of the oddity of peacekeeping forces being led by military forces, and so peacekeeping forces were led by warriors. And it seemed to me that there was a weird disjuncture, or didn't make sense to have a warrior mindset leading a transformation of a community from a warring kind of community to a peaceful community. And by that time, I knew quite a bit about pragmatism, and it seemed to me that the warrior mindset was pretty rigid. Friend, enemy, victory, defeat. These things seemed completely separate. And I knew Addams had written stuff on peace. She had 3 books on peace. And I also knew that there wasn't a lot written on her ideas of peace, mostly democracy, her ideas of democracy. So I had a faculty development leave, and I kind of took a leap where I said, maybe I should just read up on peace, peacekeeping, and on Addams' ideas of peace and see if anything can be applied to the notions of peacekeeping and form ideas of notions of peacekeeping.
Sounds like a great idea.
That's how I started, and I was really and I was reading a lot. I was reading her books. She Newer Ideals of Peace, where actually she talks about municipal housekeeping. Her first major chapter was Survival of Militarism in City Government. Somehow that seems like it could be apt today.
Wow, yeah.
Anyway, and her book about the women at The Hague, which dealt with her work during World War I with a peace conference that she led at The Hague in 1915, and her book about post-World War I, which is Peace and Bread in Time of War. I read those, and I read some of the peace literature. And I came upon this really amazing article that the title of the article was Peace Research, Just the Study of War. What? How can? And they made the argument that there was this dominant definition of peace within the peace research community, which was known as negative peace. And that's the absence of war or the absence of violence. And there's another definition of peace called positive peace that looked at the kind of community that you wanted to live in. That a peace where there is justice and freedom, and just it's something that would be maybe more organic and evolving, but certainly a lot richer than the idea of not war. But what had happened in peace research was that they had these big quantitative studies, and they had these dichotomous dependent variables. 0 is peace and 1 is war. And if you have that as your definition of peace, then you actually peace is studying war. But what that did for me is it gave me a play. Oh, Jane Addams, hers is positive peace. That's where she fits. And so I studied her ideas, and I said, well, how can I make sense out of her positive definition of peace? And one of the key things about the negative definition of peace that's problematic is that it's short run, and the peace should have a long run perspective. But what I came to was a term that captured Jane Addams' theory of peace, which I'll call peace weaving. But I can maybe step back a minute and say that she, through the women's movement, through her work with suffrage, she was involved with the peace movement in the 1890s. There were people like Andrew Carnegie and Ford. The peace movement the idea was that peace was bad for business. So business leaders were very involved in peace. And they also knew that maybe there should be a way for there to be ways to arbitrate disputes. So there's 2 meetings in The Hague, 1899 and 1907, were peace conferences where they made some important rules like international courts. And in 1915, they were going to have another Hague conference, but then there was war. Right. And all their ideas that we'd have eternal peace was kind of out the window. Yeah. And this was when Addams and her feminism came into fruition. Was, heck, women are affected by war. We should also be able to have an input into what is going on in international arena. And they borrowed some techniques that they knew that they'd used from the suffrage movement. And she actually was pretty well connected to the international suffrage movement. And they quickly put together a international conference of The Hague, but this was a women's conference. And what they wanted to do is to end the war, to start mediation, and there were resolutions. They had a set of resolutions, one of which was to have an organization, something like the League of Nations, where disputes could be resolved. That they advocated for universal suffrage throughout the world so that women could have a voice in international disputes, in war and peace.
Pat, in that last regard, I definitely see a connection to her feminism. I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about, how, if it did, her feminism inspired her advocacy for peace. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? You just touched on it a moment ago, but sort of what about feminism, was
or what about the feminist standpoint or feminine standpoint? I think that's how I might phrase it. Okay. But I think maybe if I went through what I meant by peace weaving, it would kind of come through. Excellent. Great. Because the peace, first of all, I took the metaphor of weaving because it was expansive, interconnected democratic community. Uh-huh. It had a feminine sensibility, but it also transcends gender roles. And weaving is like connects strings. Right. It's not homogenized. It's both strong and flexible. So, uh-huh. So weaving captured sort of the action and it just captured something about her ideas of peace. But her ideas of peace focused on relationships. So, and if you look at negative peace, it has nothing to do with relationship. But if we're going to be at peace, it's you have to have a conflict. You have to have more than one party. There's a relationship. So it's relationships between individuals, families, groups, nations. It's not about the absence of conflict, but rather how conflict might be worked out successfully. And this is it also, her notion of peace weaving wanted to avoid rigid moralisms, where peace, and this very much is pragmatism, is that there's fixated belief systems. If you're the enemy and I'm, friend enemy dichotomy, then, and I'm right and you're wrong, this is, if you're set in a world where you have strong rigid moralisms, that's a setup for really bad conflict. But if you can somehow ease those rigid moralisms, then that can lead to peace. And so one of the founding ideas here is sympathetic knowledge, or the ability to put yourself in another person's shoes, that you can actively understand another person's perspective. And one of the key ideas that I love with her is the perplexity. And that's this being confused or surprised, that you're able to when you put yourself in someone else's shoes, you're willing to be surprised. You're willing to see from their perspective. And that perplexity kind of opens you up because peace is about really transforming maybe an enemy into a friend. How are you going to do that? And so this notion of perplexity sets sort of the stage so that you can do that. Then also the kind of the community of inquiry, where she was, and this was informed a lot by her experiences in Chicago, because these neighborhoods were filled with individuals who came from all kinds of backgrounds in Europe where they would be seen as enemies. And yet to work on cleaning streets, if you have a practical problem you can work on, then you can leave your moral certitude and say, how am I going to solve this problem? And in the process, you can begin to put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Nice.
That's a forum for sympathetic understanding. And also sort of her notion of participatory democracy, the community of interest of inquiry, is that anyone who is concerned with this problem should have a voice. And then we should act and see whether or not that helps to resolve it. And if it does, fine. If it doesn't, try something else. Sounds pretty pragmatic, huh?
Right, right.
Another one of her ideas was lateral progress, which is, how do you judge how well a society is doing? You could rejoice that, the company is making millions and millions of dollars and has new products. But if you're not looking at how well the most vulnerable are doing, that's what you should concentrate on if you're talking about how well your society is doing.
Yeah.
So I think you could see it's shaped by her experiences and her feminine standpoint because of this involvement and caring that is everywhere in this definition, in this peace weaving. So here's what I said peace weaving is. It's about building the fabric of peace by emphasizing relationships. Peace weaving builds these positive relationships by working on practical problems, engaging people widely with sympathetic understanding, while recognizing that progress is measured by the welfare of the vulnerable.
Perfect. I really, really like that. This idea of peace is this positive peace and peace weaving. Can I ask one very quick, just clarificatory question? When Addams won the Peace Prize in 1931, was there a stated reason? Was it her work with the Whole House, or was it all this sort of life work?
Well, right after the conference, there's delegates of women from the conference who traveled to all the countries and include the United States, and met with the leaders, trying to get them to and the war. So it was a combination of the most direct reasons, and I looked at the nominations, had to do with her work with the peace conference, with the delegation, and with the creation of the organization which exists today, the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. That was the organization, that was the genesis of, or the first conference was a genesis of this organization, which is active today.
Yeah.
So did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, thanks everybody for listening to this segment of Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Eric Weber. My co-host is Anthony Cashio, and we've been learning a ton from the great Pat Shields. We'll be back with one more segment after a short break.
Welcome back, friends, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber, and today we've been having an absolutely fantastic conversation with Pat Shields about feminism and peace, Jane Addams' legacy. In the last two segments, we kind of talked about her work with sort of the feminist perspective, as she brought it to Jane Addams brought it to Hull House, and her ideas about peace and peace weaving, and that kind of led to her work earning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. In this last segment, we're going to wrap it up with a final big picture question or two. We're going to ask about whether or not Pat thinks philosophy bakes bread. I'm going to guess where she's going to go with that. And then in with a lighthearted joke or two. Maybe they'll even be funny. Sometimes. That's our goal. Sometimes. And then we'll end with a question for our listeners to think about as if we go about our day's business.
That's right. So Pat, I want to ask you a question about feminism and Addams' inspiration in the world today. So here's the question. If Addams were alive today, what do you think she'd be fighting for, such as with regard to women?
Well, I think she surely would be fighting for immigrant rights, and particularly women. If you want to take with regard to women, there's a lot of women and children who are trying to immigrate from very bad places, and she would try to figure out how to make their lives better. I think she would also be someone who'd be very concerned about climate change. That would be a big deal for her. I think she might be involved with the United Nations. I mean, there's a lot of things that the United Nations is working on, which now incorporates women's perspectives in ways that it hadn't. So I think she'd be working on that. And that's kind of a legacy. The resolutions that they came up with in the Women's Conference, many of those resolutions, you can see them actuated with UN resolutions which involve women.
That's a great answer.
I like it. You know, when Addams began her work, women did not even have the right to vote, right? But recently, and as of our recording, we have a record number of women who recently got elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. But only a little over 20% of the Senate is made up of women today, right? So we got, a lot of progress is happening, but more work to be done. What do you think are the prospects for greater parity in the next 50 years? What do you think Addams would have to say about that? Would she be kind of happy with the direction things are going? And what advice might she give?
Well, I think that she would be happy with greater representation of women in the Congress. That is certainly true. But I also think she would be pretty unhappy with the polarization that is part of the rigid moralisms that are just everywhere.
Right.
So the divided, the red state, blue state, she would be working to try to figure out how to have the purple state. But I do think that, you could see it that women legislators tend to be a little less rigid, I think, in terms of how they vote. They're more likely to cross the aisle, and I think that she would be happy about that. That's for sure.
Excellent. So, Pat, in recent years, lots of positions in the military have opened up to women, and there are still some positions that are not yet open to women, such as in the Navy SEALs. And so my question is there a tension at the same time in advocating for women to have access to all these positions and with thinking about feminism as a movement for peace?
Yes, I think there's a big tension, and that probably would be something that might be incomplete. I don't think Addams really envisioned a lot of women in the military when she was thinking about all of this. And I think you could see in Afghanistan and other places that women as part of the teams which go into the community and speak to other women, I think that would be something that she would be very happy to see.
Interesting. So even in capacity as warriors, as you brought it up earlier, women might be helpful in peacemaking efforts even as soldiers. Is that right? Right.
She was criticized for her ideas of peace, partly because she had a hard time thinking that militaries made a lot of sense in a way. I don't think that she really thought that through completely. However, I find her ideas really useful in the importance of thinking in the big picture, the long run. I mean, if the military basically has a short run notion of peace, it's the end of war. But then if the end of war, if victory and peace are conflated, what happens next? One of the reasons we have had such an amazing post-World War II peace is because enemies have become friends. Mm-hmm. And how do we do that? How do we think about that? That's a long-run question.
Nice. That's a very good point. Indeed.
I like that.
Yeah.
In fact, that actually sets us up for kind of our sort of one of our final questions, which comes from the inspiration for our show. Would you, Pat, say that philosophy bakes no bread, as the famous saying goes, that it's not practical? I kind of think we've argued against that the whole show, but we would ask you just bluntly, is philosophy bake no bread, or that it does bake bread, and why and how, and can you explain?
Well, if it didn't bake bread, we wouldn't be talking today, because I actually have never taken a philosophy course in my life. I came to the conclusion that since I had a PhD, I could learn something on my own, and was tutored by Vince Louisi. But if it didn't have offer ideas that would be useful in the world, I wouldn't be interested.
There you go.
All right.
Fantastic. Well, Pat, in every episode, we want to make sure people both see the serious side of philosophy, which we've touched on significantly, I think, as well as the lighter side. So we have a bit in this last segment that we call Philosoph-Funnies. Say, Philosoph-Funnies.
Philosoph-Funnies.
Say, Philosoph-Funnies.
Philosoph-Funnies.
So we'd love to hear if you've got a favorite joke or a funniest fact or a story to tell about philosophy or about Jane Addams and what we've been talking about. Have you got a funny story or a joke to tell us?
Yes, I do. One of my favorite Jane Addams pieces is her tongue-in-cheek speech where she talks about imagining a world where women were in charge and men were seeking the franchise, and what women might do to say no. So here's a little bit of that. Let us imagine an absurd hypothesis that the political machinery were in the hands of women. Let us consider various replies which these citizen women might reasonably make to the men who are seeking the franchise. First, could not the women say, our most valid objection to extending the franchise to you is that you are so fond of fighting. You always have been since you were little boys. You'd very likely forget that the real object of the state is to nurture and protect lives. And out of sheer vainglory, you would be voting away huge sums of money for battleships. Second, would not the hypothetical women note, we have carefully built up a code of factory legislation for the protection of the workers in modern industry. We know that you men have always been careless about the house, perfectly indifferent to the necessity for sweeping and cleaning. If you were made responsible for factory legislation, it is quite probable that you would let the workers in the textile mills contract tuberculosis through needless breathing the fluff. Anyway, so that's I think it sort of captures a funny side of Jane Addams and incorporates what we've talked about today.
Sure does. That's excellent. Well, in every episode, Anthony and I also gather a joke or two, and we happen to find two that are basically kind of headlines or lines from publications that came out sounding kind of funny. And one of them was from a church bulletin, and the other one was a real newspaper headline. And I thought they were pretty cute. So, Anthony, you want to read this first one?
Yeah, this was a church bulletin, and they printed it out, and it just says, "The peacemaking meeting scheduled for today has been rescheduled due to a conflict."
and then the real news headline is evidently this was actually printed in a newspaper. War dims hope for peace. Oh boy,
that's great. Well, last but not least, we do like to take advantage of the fact that today we have some powerful social media that allow for two-way communications, even for programs like radio shows. So we want to invite our listeners to send us their thoughts about big questions we raise on the show.
That's right. Given that, Pat, we'd love to hear your thoughts about what question we should ask everyone for future segments that we call You Tell Me. Sometimes we have past guests back on the show. Sometimes we just, are able to air a voicemail that we get from a listener and so on. Well, we want to pose questions for our listeners. So do you have a question to ask our listeners?
It would have something to do with resolving the rigid perspectives that dominate our political scene and how they might suggest we move to a world where there's less rigid belief systems and we actually talk to one another.
Ooh,
I like that a lot.
I do too. My goodness, that sounds like
how can we move? Yeah, peace weaving.
I mean, I think that it's hard to move people into perplexity when they have all the answers.
Right. Very nice. Well, Pat, is there anything you'd like to plug about your journal or about your book that's come out? Anything you want to talk about that's upcoming or that you want the world to know about?
Okay, I think people might, if they want to learn more, my book on Jane Addams really does focus on her ideas and her contribution to the world of ideas.
Excellent. Well, check it out, folks. We're going to have a link to the book on our show notes page for this episode when it comes out in the podcast.
Oh, I know another one. I have a YouTube video that is sponsored by the journal Public Integrity, which discusses Jane Addams' social ethics.
Excellent.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay.
It's about a 10-minute video.
Perfect. We'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. Your hosts today, Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber, are really grateful to have been joined by Patricia Shields, and we hope you listeners will join us again. Consider sending us your thoughts about anything you've heard today that you'd like to hear about in the future or about this specific question that Pat has raised for you, right? How do we move into the state of perplexity where we can actually start talking to each other again?
I think that's an important question.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
That's right, folks. Remember that you can catch us on Twitter, Facebook, and on our website at philosophybakesbread.com. And there you'll find transcripts from many of our episodes. And one more thing, folks, if you want to support the show and to be more involved in the work of the Society of Philosophers in America, SOPHIA, the easiest thing to do is to go consider joining as a member at philosophersinamerica.com.
And if you're enjoying the show, and we really hope you are, maybe take a quick second to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to us today. You can, of course, always email us at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com. And you can also leave us a short recorded message with a question or a comment that we may be able to play on the show at 859-257-1849. I want to take a second now to thank you again for this wonderful conversation, Pat, and I hope you will consider joining us again sometime soon. I've learned a tremendous amount, so thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks a lot for your encouragement.
It was a lot of fun talking with you.
Oh, it's absolutely fantastic.
I do feel very, even though I'm not trained as a philosopher, I feel very welcomed by the world of philosophy.
Good. You have trained yourself as a philosopher, I would say.
Well, thank you.
Well, and we hope everyone listening will join us again next time on Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.